Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today at the Oxford Forum, Steps to a Sustainable Future. My name is Zoe Coakless-Bartley and I'm Director of Sustainability at Oxford University Press. I'm part of our Technology and Operations Senior Leadership team, and I work with colleagues from across the organisation to better understand our environmental impacts and plan the steps we need to take to mitigate them. I'm really pleased to be here chairing this session today. As part of our commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goal Publishers Compact, OUP is proud to be working towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Over the next hour, we're going to examine the responsibility on content providers such as ourselves to support the goal of climate action and to combat misinformation and climate fatigue as we tackle this multi-generational emergency. Before we start, I'd like to share how today's session will run. I'm shortly going to hand over to our panel to introduce themselves before starting the conversation. We really welcome any questions you have and hope to get to as many of these as possible with the time we have today. Audience microphones are muted, so please use the chat box to share your comments and thoughts, and there's a Q&A tab for you to post your questions. We have a team of moderators on hand to help you with technical issues in the chat box, should you have any. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to our panel to give a short introduction about themselves, their career, and their perspective in today's conversation. And I'd like to start with you, Jamie.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm Jamie Cloud, and I run the Cloud Institute for Sustainability Education here in the United States. And I am one of the founders of the field of education for sustainability. We didn't have internet when it all began in the late 80s and early 90s. And I spend most of my time in schools and school districts doing curriculum design, coaching, professional learning, organizational change, leadership development, and then a certain amount of research and development. And I'm happy to be here.
That's great. Thank you. Ali?
Hi, my name's Ali Micklem, and I'm phoning in from Italy today, where we don't have as many April showers as we would like to have. So I'm a parent stakeholder in our school system. My children attend a European school, which is one of 13 schools which offer a European baccalaureate. So as a parent stakeholder, I have a local role, which is a bit like being on a board of governors in the UK with a bit more parent representation. And I also have a kind of policy-making hat. So I sit on the policy-making process as part of Interparents, which is an umbrella group representing parents of more than 28,000 pupils in our system. Very quickly, my background was teaching and publishing. I've also worked in communications, also for Oxfam, and I did a master's where I was looking at how grassroots lobbying kind of affects high-level decision-making. And I feel like that's completely helping me in what I'm trying to do, which is with my policy-making hat, I'm trying to get education for sustainable development onto our school syllabi, into their pedagogical planning and into their business plans. And then locally, I'm doing the same thing, but through the lens of a sustainability strategy, which I helped create. And the idea is that we work as stakeholders to pool all of our resources to achieve the targets that we've set. So I would say I'm delighted to be here. So happy to be able to learn from Jamie. And I think this is what we need to do. We need to train everybody up in what does education for sustainable development actually mean, and then we take away some of the fear.
Great, thank you. And Leo?
Oh, thanks, Zoe, and thanks to Jamie and Ali as well. And also thanks to I've just been looking at the chat box, amazing array of people kind of leaving hellos from all over the world. So that's fantastic. So yeah, my name's Leo Hickman. I edit a website called Carbon Brief and have done since 2015. We're a sort of a smallish team of specialist reporters and journalists kind of around the world who report very, very closely on climate change, both the science and the policy response to climate change. And my background is well, I'm a journalist, and I spent 16 years at The Guardian. I was a sort of feature writer and kind of columnist and editor and all sorts. And over that time, I specialised in environmental issues. And then towards the end of my time at The Guardian, really, really zoomed in on climate change. And during that period, I wrote a few books around environmental issues, but particularly pertinent for today, perhaps, is I wrote a children's book explaining climate change to children for Puffin. I don't know if we're allowed to mention other publishers here. But it was interesting because it was probably that I've often described it as the hardest writing assignment I've ever had, trying to explain something as complicated, as nuanced and pivotal and, as you said before, a kind of emergency scale issue for an intergenerational issue and kind of global issue, trying to explain that to children. When I say children, I mean it was pitched at ages of 12 to 16. So as we all know, that's a huge range to try and explain something like that to. So yeah, that was really challenging. But now my audience is very much a kind of an adult audience around the world, particularly people who work on climate change, because we try what we call our journalism explainer journalism. We're very, very policy neutral. We don't have a view. We don't publish any comment. We don't publish any opinion pieces. And that's intentional because we feel actually there's enough opinion and noise around the world about climate change. We just want to be in the business of building very, very trusted and authoritative and respected journalism about climate change, which other people can use as their sort of foundational base to go off and do their own research, commentary, whatever it may be. But we, in doing that, have been right at the kind of the center of this kind of maelstrom of misinformation and issues and attacks on climate change, which I'm sure we're going to discuss over the course of this session. But yeah, thanks, Zoe.
Great, thank you, and welcome, as you say, Leo, to our very global audience. And for anyone in the UK, we can confirm to Ali that we have all the April showers. So, you know.
So somebody asked for the name of the website, of Leo's website.
Oh, yes, sorry. And also I should stress, I'm in England as well. I'm about an hour south of London in Hampshire, and I'm just looking out the window and it's actually sunny at this very, very moment, but it's sure to be threatened by rain. So yeah, the website is carbonbrief.org. I'll drop it in the chat box as well. I'll do that now.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, to kick off the questions, really, starting with an open question to you all, what do you think is the unique role that educators play in the climate conversation?
I would love to start on that one. I think one of our most powerful roles is the power to cultivate thinking over time, vertically, especially the different way of thinking that's required to bring in a new paradigm and to prepare young people for the new paradigm, and that characterizes education for sustainability and regeneration. That to me is the most powerful thing. Examples would be learning how to learn and self-regulated learning and being able to self-assess yourself as you go, as we all do when we're adults. We need to be in charge of that, and the many ways of knowing. And then just briefly, some of the kinds of thinking that we can cultivate. We have a set of benchmarks that authors around the world have helped us to develop over time. And the three ways of thinking that keep coming up as core are emergent thinking, lateral thinking, and creative thinking, and design thinking, and futures thinking, complex thinking, which includes systems thinking and critical thinking, of course, and then, of course, mindful thinking, metacognition, reflective thinking, all those kinds of things. That is our business, cultivating thinking, and that's our unique contribution.
Fabulous. I think you've covered so many things. I would comment from my perspective, I would agree the classroom is a really meditative space. But I'd like to think beyond that. You know, people who are educated about sustainability tend to pass on what they know. You know, it's all about communications as well. And I'm only here today because somebody who knew all about sustainability passed on what she knew and gave me a space to get involved in my school. I then went away and upskilled myself. I took a short course in business sustainability management. And now I feel I have some more tools to go forward in my life and actually be active in doing something. So I think education is incredibly powerful, and I would also connect the organizational space to that learning. So.
And the luxury of time, I think, is another thing that's quite unique to us. 13 years is a really long time to have all the children and young people legally required to be with us.
Mm-hmm. I think giving people a sense of urgency is very important. And I think actually the fact that you're able to hold that space with people and actually, really just get a sense that it's now, that the time is now.
Yeah, I've got. I'm coming at this probably more as a parent of teenagers, kind of, rather than an actual educator myself. I don't really self-describe as an educator. I guess I sort of am part of that sort of information creation and the responsibility around that, obviously, as a journalist. But it's very striking to me, just chatting to my own children and their kind of cohort at school, and just how challenging that environment is and how the battle for information and minds is, particularly on social media, and particularly things like TikTok and Instagram and things. And I try with my colleagues to watch, and where we can, influence and rebut and fact check and things that we see kind of false claims that appear around issues like climate change. And that, it's been very striking just in the last few months with the new era of Twitter under Elon Musk, and just the increased amount of we just tweeted something yesterday, for example, very, very simple bit of analysis looking at the amount of the human population around the planet that have experienced record-breaking temperatures over the last decade, and it showed that effectively half of the global human population has now experienced a record temperature in the last decade. Very simple bit of analysis, very uncontroversial in many ways. But when we tweeted it, we've had just like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people sort of denying climate change and saying this is rubbish and things. So we're constantly engaged in this, for want of a better term, battle of ideas, battle of reason, battle of thoughts, battle of facts. And it's ongoing, and I've been kind of engaged in that for 15 years, really, because it was like this when I was at The Guardian, and we kind of go through ebbs and flows, but it feels particularly bad at the moment, and particularly bad on social media. So I think in terms of, training, if you like, and educating our children to reason and to think and to challenge some of that misinformation and to have that critical thinking, I think is absolutely essential.
Thanks. So, I mean, staying with the misinformation point, and Leo, building what you just said, it can be difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. And OUP published a report quite recently called Matter of Fact, which found that 3/4 of people trust that what they read on social media is true. What skills do learners need to navigate all of the information out there on climate change, true or false, and determine what is fact?
So I think, well, media literacy, obviously, when I was growing up in the 60s, we had a lot of media literacy, how to unpack multiple perspectives, how to look at bias, how to understand the interests that underlie people's positions. We had a lot of that, and then somehow it disappeared. So I would say media literacy is key. I think it's really important for kids to understand how their brains work. There's a lot of wonderful new brain science and brain science for kids, even the younger ones, so that they can understand mental models and schema and how you can get stuck in your frame and not see anything that doesn't fit into your frame. And that's how confirmation bias gets started. I think they need to recognize neuroplasticity, for example, that they need to be able to keep their minds sharp and always accommodating as well as assimilating. So that would be a few things that I think about all the time, so that they never get stuck just trying to confirm what they think they already know out of fear.
I feel like I want to give a practical sort of, not practical, but quite a short answer in a sense. I think about Kimberly Nicholas, and I think about those 5 ideas that are so central. The idea that it is warming, we're sure, it's us, it's bad, and we can fix it. And from my perspective, with the people that I speak to, I feel like this is the information that I'm always trying to convey. A sense of, more literacy, more carbon literacy. I think that's actually another thing perhaps we'll touch on later. But, the fact that, practically it's here and now.
I think what Jamie was saying about the experience of media literacy and the change in that over the recent decades is really, really fascinating, because I think if we all go back to our sort of childhoods and remember who were the figures of trust and who were the figures of authority, who did we go to rely on for the facts of the world, and it would probably be teachers, parents, maybe a priest, or there's lots of we can all think of those figures, and
newscasters. You could trust
newscasters,
newscasters.
and I was going to say, newscasters, and incredibly the TV anchors, the Dan Rathers and all those people of yesteryear were hugely influential. And in this very sort of atomized world now with social media and a whole bunch of influencers that we, as parents and or teachers looking to kids, we don't really fully know who those people are often, because we're not on their screens all the time. And it's kind of a scary time to be a parent in many ways, because you have kind of lost control about who those influencers are.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we try and do at Carbon Brief in a way. We've tried to build this kind of sanctuary of trusted and authoritative journalism about climate change, which is bulletproof in many ways. We straddle between mainstream media and academia in the fact that our journalism is evergreen, it's very evidenced, we cite all our sources, etc. It's almost a bit like a Wikipedia type of format, and there's no voice. We're intentionally voiceless, and that's to try and create and build up a kind of a foundational set of explainers and Q&As and interactives and maps that people, and we know this from the teaching community and teachers that we hear from, professors and things, that they use our journalism a lot as teaching aids because they feel that they can trust it. And that is very, very hard earned. We've spent more than a decade building up that trust and authority, and we know it can evaporate in a flash if we trip up or we make a mistake.
Well, I was just going to say, it's more than a feeling, right, Leo? They can trust it because you do cite your sources. You do everything you're supposed to do to be trustworthy.
But equally, someone can have their head turned in a flash by someone making an interesting sounding claim on social media or on the TV news or wherever it is. So you're in this battle of ideas and battle of facts all the time, and all you can really do is try and shore up and make sure that you've got this sort of almost like force field around you that you've built up, this shield in a way that people feel that they can come into your environment of journalism, writing, whatever it may be, that they feel like can. But that is difficult. I don't think there's a magic sauce that we can all apply on that. I think we can probably all agree on some foundational ways to build up that trust and authority. But it's easy to lose.
I think schools also have another kind of literacy that they're responsible for, which is science literacy.
Yeah.
We spend quite a bit of time helping young people distinguish a fact from an opinion and make reasoned arguments and back up with evidence. And that's good old-fashioned understanding what the role of science is. So, and I think that the last 20 years or so, where science wasn't a main thing, at least in the schools in the US, people don't have what they need to understand the role of science and why you can trust it. We just wrote a whole unit for Philadelphia Public Schools on why trust science. And it was fascinating. And the difference between laws and theories and all of that. And most of the faculty didn't didn't know, didn't remember any of that. It was fascinating. So that's another kind of literacy that we can help, so that Leo can do his job, educators can do our job.
But you've got a fantastic case study in the US of a very highly trusted figure, the US president, for example, who historically has, sure, there's politics involved, but traditionally in the US president is a figure of authority. But you've just had come out of a presidency where a president has been intentionally undermining the knowledge around climate change and saying it's a hoax invented by the Chinese or whatever, demonstrably false, but playing, making a political play around the trusted authority of a US president.
Right. But that wouldn't be so easy to get away with if you had literate citizens. If kids grew up being able to think well like that wouldn't have been so easy.
You've got a whole media ecosystem supporting that president, right? You've got such a polarized, partisan media landscape, as we saw with Fox News yesterday getting rid of one of its key presenters. You've got a whole ecosystem of enablers, effectively enabling that particular president at the top of the pyramid, so sort of to make that false claim around climate change.
Yeah. But again, that relies on an educated public.
Yeah.
And I don't think we were prepared for that at all. Obviously, I think everybody can attest to that.
I think we'll come back to the fact in a second, because I think that's really important to talk about. But we've got a couple of great audience questions about the fiction. The first one's from Rachel Perkins, who, assuming it's the same Rachel Perkins, is a colleague at OUP, who says, how do you cope with the energy, time and attention drain from battling the flood of climate denial on social media?
I mean, from my perspective, I could say that's almost my job. That's literally what I do, and I've been trying to do that for 10, 15 years, day to day, hour by hour, taking on and trying to rebut and fact check this stuff. And you could say that that's, a losing game to some extent, because as much as it's like playing whack-a-mole. As soon as you knock one down, more come. And particularly, as I said, earlier about the new reality of things like Twitter under its new kind of control. But I think to add to what Jamie was saying, it is about education, and if we can create these sort of trusted, tablets of information that hopefully are very, very robust and can be used by others, including educators, to share, to cite, to teach with, then hopefully in the long game is that this will get through. But it is challenging, and it's really not made any easier. In fact, it's aggravated by the way that the social media companies run their algorithms and cite freedom of speech and all these kind of things, where they effectively give a free pass because it suits their kind of business model to allow this kind of anger and kind of partisanship to build up.
Right. I would also add, yes, I totally agree with all of that. And I would say, Buckminster Fuller once said, don't spend time trying to argue against what is, create the new, and that makes the old one obsolete. He said it better than I. But we don't focus on all of that. We focus on our responsibility as gratitude, as Robin Walls Kimmerer said. We focus on the world we want, the future we want, the present we want, and what we need to do to get there. And then we use the problems and the current reality as our baseline for how do we get from here to there. We actually think that's a lot, that the more you focus on the problems and the threats, the more you reinforce the thinking that caused them, because it generates dopamine in the brain. People love a good problem and a good threat, even though it's scary, but it shuts down thinking. And if you have people who are not thinking well, you're not going to have an interesting conversation, and you're not going to make any change.
I mean,
so yeah, go on, Ali.
No, I mean, I was going to just make a point really about the organizational space, or the classroom space itself, trying to reflect the values that you're teaching in your lessons. So the idea that we can try and create spaces where you can actually live what you're learning as a way of reinforcing the message. That's really the point that I was going to make, just to add to what Jamie was saying.
Yeah, make it real for kids. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just going to say that there's a I wouldn't say it's a big debate, but there is a debate within journalism at the moment, and I'd be fascinated to hear if it's the same within publishing or within teaching, about what we would call in journalism solutions journalism. So to spin off of what Jamie was saying, this idea that that we as journalists, as opposed to the traditional role of the journalist, explaining, reporting on what's going on, we actually, within our reporting, build in solutions, which is a quasi form of advocacy. And there's a big debate within journalism around whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do around something like climate change, or whether that ultimately undermines the trust the audience has of that particular journalist or that publication. And I don't think there's definitively a right or wrong answer to that personally. I think for Carbon Brief, our own style of journalism, I don't think that's the right methodology to adopt. But if I was wearing my old Guardian hat, which has very clear politics, very clear kind of view of the world, and often I did write these kind of columns or pieces where it would be me expressing very much a view of what I think a solution should be or could be. But I think it's being very clear and transparent with your audience, and in my case, kind of readers, about who you are, what you're doing. I think that it's a transparency is very important in building up trust within any communicator. I think about, what your methodology is, show your workings, as we're told at school, and building up that case. That's a really core part of our journalism, is the sort of the show your working kind of philosophy. We feel that's helpful in building up the trust with our audience, if they can see with total transparency how we've arrived at that fact or that piece of analysis or whatever it may be.
Right. And students having the experience of trying to do that themselves in school, as Ali was saying, and giving them the space to have those kinds of difficult conversations over time and practicing that, should also allow them to see what that's like and build the trust.
Thanks. Well, I think there's a related question, Leo, it's directed to you, but obviously Jamie and Ali, please feel free to jump in as well. The question from Kate Groughton is, do you feel the tide is turning and that more people are now seeing the urgency around climate change, or is the number of climate deniers growing?
I think probably both. Can that be true? I think both can be true, right? I think more and more people are certainly aware of the issue, but with that brings more and more people who want to deny or, be skeptical about the idea. And I think what we're seeing if I reverse up sort of 10, 15 years ago, when I first started to write about almost what I would describe almost the social phenomenon of climate denial, the actual almost ideological and almost sometimes emotional rejection of the idea that there's this, huge threat, existential threat in many senses. It's psychologically, you can actually understand why there is this form of denial, and it's been studied by academics, over the last few decades. But so I think you can have both. There's undoubtedly more awareness. A pivotal moment, I think, in the UK at least, anyway, and I think this is probably reflected globally. A pivotal moment in the last couple of decades was in early 2019, late 2018, early 2019. If you remember, in late 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced their probably the most impactful report they've ever published, which was what will the impact of climate change be at 1.5 degrees of warming? Something that they were the global community of scientists were directly asked to produce as a result of the Paris Agreement being adopted in 2015. That came out and it actually had a surprisingly big impact and directly led to the Greta Thunbergs, the Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes that we saw in the early phase of 2019. That then directly led to, in the UK anyway, a change in the UK law and to make the net zero target legal. So effectively net zero emissions by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. So there was a huge, and that itself created a huge wave of media coverage and political debate, and just it was a kind of snowballing effect, to probably use the wrong analogy. Maybe it's appropriate, I don't know. The melting snowball effect, and I think that has seen this counterpunch back again now. 2-3 years on, there's now this big kind of backlash, particularly in right-leaning, right-wing kind of media, against the Extinction Rebellions, the Greta Thunbergs, the kind of the passion, particularly from younger campaigners and younger populations, saying, we're scared, we want something to happen, we want the politicians to act on climate change. And there being this kind of rebounding of denying and doubting of the climate change, which again, I keep making this point, but it's being amplified, and the fact being given kind of rocket boosters by social media, I think, and some particularly mainstream media enablers, I think. So I think, to answer that kind of a long-winded way, I think both of those things are happening.
Yeah. And I think people, when they are in that fear state or that threat state, their brains shut down. And they are not able to, they want to deny it. It would be great if it wasn't true. But I think the other thing is that people focus on the problem or the symptoms of the problems, and they are not accompanying the news with, what are we going to do about it? And so people just hear that we're going down, and they don't hear that they have any efficacy or any sort of way forward. So they would prefer to just ignore it, and that's not helpful.
Great, thank you. Ali, anything to add from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we see, I mean, I don't know, I feel like denialism isn't something that really occurred to me until I started really trying to sell the idea, of making changes to our PAs and our actual physical environments and our, setting goals, setting targets, just moving forward. And I feel like as soon as people felt they were going to have to actually step up and talk about it, the fear came in. And they're like, no, this is, I discovered that parents actually feared being forced to make changes. So they feared being forced to stop.
Autonomy. Loss of autonomy.
Loss of autonomy, exactly. So, I mean, a lot of this work, that I'm doing is about explaining that is not the case. This is not about, accepting that climate change is real is not about saying I've lost everything. No, it's about saying, let's step up together. We can step up together and decide together what our beautiful future is going to look like. And,
The other thing that the brain scientists say is that sometimes you have to exercise your free won't so you can exercise your free will. We cannot unwire our way of thinking. We can only rewire it. And unless we have an alternative, a better idea, and a better place to go, then all we can think about is, then we're kind of stuck in the way we think. And so that's why I said, I think we need to be making sure we're accompanying the message about free won't. We have to change, and here's where we're going, and here's what we need to do. Because people's status, their money, their identity are all tied in this old paradigm and in the current reality. And we need to help them see that their life is going to be better when we switch gears and make the mid-course correction. But we don't spend as much time on that part. And I think we need to, because I think people know the bad news at this point, but they're kind of stuck. And again, that's our role as content providers, to help them get unstuck and help them see that their responsibility is gratitude and not just hang on to what they've got.
Absolutely.
Because it's unsustainable. So it's not like they're going to get to hang on to it for much longer. And it's better if they really want autonomy. It's better for them to be make their unique contributions to the future we want.
It's interesting that we've had two, in very recent history, globally significant situations, both the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine situation, really turning upside down both our outlook on energy security, where and how we get our energy from, and also obviously during the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, a sort of fleeting moment to sort of pause and have a look at, sort of come off that kind of fast-paced planet that we live off, and obviously we would never want to live through that again. It was a traumatic period of time for so many people around the planet. But it interestingly, it did, just from a sort of analyst point of view, looking at sort of energy trends and things around the planet, it was interesting to see that moment where we didn't have basically any mobility going on the planet, and to try and seeing things like nature quickly filling back into those urban spaces in days sometimes. It was an extraordinary moment, almost like hopefully a kind of teaching moment, and almost, well, let's hope it was a unique moment and we don't have to go through that again. But very interesting how within this kind of journey of trying to grapple as a species and as a global community with something like climate change, how we had these two potentially, and whether we've learned from that or not, what people describe as teachable moments, kind of moments of reflection to sort of think about our fast-paced world slightly in a different angle. And I don't know, it's an open question. Have we learned from that in terms of what you were both saying, Jamie and Ali, about painting this picture of a much more positive, beautiful world that we should aim and aspire to, rather than just saying our current world is a bad setup and we're getting things wrong?
I think there's both, as usual. I'm busier than I've ever been because a lot of schools and school systems took that moment, that teachable moment, and turned the problem into an opportunity to finally make the shift that they wanted to make. And those that I hadn't started working with, there's still people complaining and stuck where we were. And so you have both. You have the people that made that mid-correction already, at least in their thinking, and those that are still stuck. And so we need to have more storytelling and more examples of what happens when you actually make this shift in your thinking and your behavior, and you actually start moving toward a sustainable future and present. What are all the benefits of that? Again, we know them. I have a lot of case studies of young people doing amazing things, and that's the quickest way to get educators excited, because that they had teachers behind them teaching them the math and the science and the how to develop social contracts. And so that's something that gets people focused on where we want to go, on the direction we want to go.
Yeah, I think a lot about the connections that came out between people during COVID, the neighbors that we spoke to, the groups that we created, like on our streets. My husband took up gardening. He planted tomatoes, never before, probably never again. But, he is out in the garden a bit more than he was before. So I think, really, sustainability, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but the idea of coming together, of working together in groups and of being connected, hopefully in nature. We know it's better for our mental health. We know it's better for our physical health. I think there's a lot that we can really positively sell, if you like, the sizzle of taking action, this kind of action. That's just better for everybody.
I think that's a nice positive note. I'm going to slightly take it back to the to the stressful side of things. We've got an audience question from Maria Fernanda Morales, referencing a point that you made a minute ago, Leo, around how we can convey the sense of urgency without causing panic or people, including children, feeling like things are out of our hands.
Leo, before you answer that question, I've been hearing that there's a sense of urgency since 1968, since I was in the 6th grade. It doesn't work. What works is to get people focused on living well within the means of nature and learning how to do that with grace and dignity and fun. This sense of this focus on the problem and the urgency just puts people in the away state. And once they're gone, you cannot get them creatively thinking about how we're going to pull this off together. And so I know that the problem is the threat, and the brain wants to go there and it wants to stay there. But focusing on that does not change things. Now, go, Leo.
I see this kind of play out. It's almost like Groundhog Day for me. But every year, as a journalist, I go to the UN climate meetings, and you see the same political speeches, the same presentations from the scientists, and you sometimes think, really, everyone? I'm sure we did all this last year, and kind of you get this kind of incrementalism where it's always the last chance to act. It's always, the final call. It's always, we must do this today for our future generations. And yet politicians, because they're operating on these short political cycles of 4 or 5 years, effectively never think beyond that. It's almost baked in that their political survival can't think mid to long term. They have to think short term. So we're, unfortunately, we're pretty much locked into that political dynamic sometimes. But it is also important. But it is important to keep, as we do at Carbon Brief, kind of laying out the facts of climate change. Plot those graphs, show those trend lines. Where we're going, because there is, going back to that word incrementalism, it's also a positive way of looking at it. Every little bit makes a difference. So sure, we may well, and we probably will bust past 1.5 degrees of warming. We may even do that with 2 degrees C of warming, and the impacts of that are pretty severe, and increasingly severe. But every bit of emission we prevent, it is worth doing. And it's so we're sort of locked in at these kind of UN climate talks often as it's almost like it's presented as cliff edge politics. Like, if we don't do this right now, land this deal right now, we're all going to fall off this cliff, which is, as Jamie's saying, is a kind of negative, is a sort of negative framing, as opposed to saying, let's reach out to that positive vision of a future and let's run towards it, rather than sort of running away from a more awful future. So it does often come down to the way things are described and are framed, and it just happens to be that what we do at Carbon Brief is explaining the latest science, is explaining the latest policy document or whatever, and in a way we're quite geeky and wonky in what we and that's our kind of thing. But we're part, as I said at the beginning, a kind of part of a much bigger ecosystem of communicators and journalists, many people doing different types of ways of communicating this, so that we've all in a way got a responsibility and a role to do in this.
I really I love the idea, we all do what we can, that just incremental change, that little thing that we try to do, because the kids at school, they're also content creators. They can sit and write a letter about how they feel. They can make a painting about what they're feeling, about what's happening to them. Just recently, we connected with World Water Day, and we all got together to make a bouquet of hummingbirds. And the idea is that the children could all think about water, what they would do to save water, and they could make 3D hummingbirds. We hung them up. We celebrated that idea. And then next year, what are we going to do next year to build on that? We're kind of following our little strategy. We have our little targets in our little world, and we're just plugging away. Every week we show up and we just plug away, moving forwards slowly. But you have to have a sense that you are going to get somewhere. And when you see where you've come from, and however small, it's something, it gives you a sense that you can just keep going. You just keep going.
So when we get to the question about what we all need to know in order to understand climate change and global warming and what's going on. And
that's the next one, Jamie.
Yeah, I think that's going to help us, because once people begin to understand those things, and know and be able to do those things, it's going to help. Yeah. So go ask the question. And then
we've covered question one. I mean, yes, as Jamie says, the second question, and obviously we've covered a lot more than that, is around what I'm going to put two together here, actually. What do educators and learners, as two separate groups of stakeholders, need to know in order to understand climate change? And adding on to that is an audience question from Christian Yaguno. How can content providers ensure their work is accessible and understandable to people who may not have a background in science and climate policy? So those two together.
Yeah. Yeah, the second one first for me. I have a friend that's a physicist who started as a physicist and then ended up teaching elementary school. And to Leo's point earlier, trying to figure out what not to say so people can understand you is really, really challenging. So now I'll flip to the first question. For me, first of all, we all need to be playing our A game at this point in our history. This is not a drill. That we are making a mid-course correction. The children are counting on us, and we need to be firing with all cylinders. So some of the things, for example, that people need to know in order to understand what's going on include things like all systems are perfectly designed to get the results they get. We are here because we bought and sold for it, we educated for it, we designed for it. We built for it unintentionally, and that's systems are very counterintuitive. You can have unintended consequences you didn't plan on, and it all begins with a change in thinking, and thinking about thinking becomes the most upstream place to intervene in the system. We're all responsible for the difference we make, because everything we do and everything we don't do makes a difference. And that's something people don't walk around thinking about. In the context of interdependence, there's no such thing as not making a difference. So we need to be intentional about the difference we want to make and create that kind of structural tension that's required to have movement from where we are to where we want to be. I'll stop there for a moment. I have a couple of other specific things people need to know, but I'll open it up to Ali and Leo for their thoughts on that.
I mean, right now I'm feeling very much the vibe of carbon literacy. I'm right in the middle of doing the carbon literacy training because, although I'm not in the UK, I can see actually it really is spreading as a method of educating. And I'm thinking really of sort of adult education here, but also student level learners, particularly the work that Manchester University are doing at the moment to not just train all their staff, but to train their students, offer their students the opportunity to train themselves to become trainers in carbon literacy. And I'll just read the sort of the definition of what they suggest. They say, an awareness of the carbon dioxide costs and impacts of everyday activities, and to know how and why it's incredibly important to work to reduce emissions on an individual, community and organizational basis. And I think that's a great start for what we need to know.
In terms of the second question, I can probably speak to that most directly. In terms of at Carbon Brief, we're probably known for this really. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about every single word we use to explain climate change, each adjective, verb, noun, sentence length, paragraph length, headline, chart we make. Everything goes into that to be as simple and as plain English as possible. And actually, people say to me often, kind of, what's your background? What's your training? Are you a scientist, or how? What are all your journalists in terms of their background? And I'm surrounded by a team of incredibly knowledgeable and expert, often scientific expert, specialist journalists. But I myself am an arts graduate, and actually I see that as a massive advantage in trying to explain climate change, because I don't necessarily understand all the physics terms, or etc. So if I do what we triple edit our pieces, so we have the writer does it, then there's an exchange with the editor, their direct editor, then they have a technical edit, so someone goes in with scientific knowledge to make sure the technical points of the article's right, and then I do what's called the reader's edit. So I do the final kind of, I'm the sort of the if I don't understand it, then then something needs to change. So that, and it's kind of, we've intentionally designed the editing process around that to try and make it as plain English as possible. And yet we're still dealing with some very highly complex science and policy jargon, and this world of climate change is absolutely full of acronyms and frankly sort of silly phrases that we use as shorthand, but we try as best we can to sort of explain that. So I think that is fundamentally very important, not to assume knowledge in your audience to a certain degree.
Right. There's a few. Go ahead, Leo.
I was just going to make one final, a quick point, just what I thought about it before, some tangential thought about communicators. One thing I've done over the years, particularly when I was at The Guardian, was interview kind of business leaders, politicians, etc. And I often ask them, what was their sort of penny drop moment? What was their epiphany on climate change? When did they feel suddenly, particularly business leaders? And they so often say, actually, it was when my grandchild asked me what I was doing. It's nearly always related to a child asking a question around almost like an intergenerational responsibility kind of dynamic, saying, hey daddy, hey mummy, hey granddad, hey grandma, what are you doing that's going to help my future? Because I hear we've got this thing called climate change to deal with, to paraphrase. And it's really striking how often children themselves are the best and most authoritative communicators to an adult audience. And I think we really saw that going back to 2019 with those wave of climate strikes that went, school strikes that went around the planet, particularly young girls. That was really potent, and I think that was really, unique in the whole time I've been writing about climate change. Those school strikes were one of the most potent moments, and I know personally from speaking to politicians that was the penny drop moment for many of them.
I would add, there's a couple of, before we even get to the topic of climate change, when we're educating people about this work, particularly for a sustainable future, one thing that people don't think about much is that all living and non-living things are subject to the laws and principles derived from nature. People think they're in charge. And the idea that there are laws, when I ask people, what are the laws and principles, what are the natural laws and principles that drive your behavior? Maybe somebody thinks of gravity, but that's the only thing they can think of. So that's a big deal. So for example, there is no such place as away on this planet. It's the first law of thermodynamics and gravity, and making sure that people understand that things can't just disappear. Matter and energy aren't created or destroyed. There is no such place as away. That is absolutely shocking to almost everyone that I speak to. 2 out of every 1,000 people I speak to remember that one. So that's interesting. The fact that all systems have limits, that thresholds are our friends. Don't think of limits as loss of autonomy or scarcity. Limits keep systems, healthy systems, in dynamic balance. And so we need them. We need those thresholds. People don't think about that. What we call bathtub thinking, stocks and flows. You have the faucet coming in and the drain going out of the bathtub. You don't want to have more coming in faster than it can come out. So we need to obviously reduce the faucet, the emissions, and increase the drain, which is the sequestration. Really, that's almost what people need to know. There are a few other things I would add to that, but just getting that bathtub thinking going to people, whether it's about nutrition and the body or fishing or climate change, just understanding stocks and flows will save everybody a lot of time. Ecosystem services, the fact that the planet regulates its own, has been regulating its own climate historically. since the Big Bang, and what ecosystem services are that we get for free from nature. That greenhouse gases actually protect us when they're in the right balance, and that it's our putting them in imbalance that is wreaking havoc on us. Just a couple more things. These are just real specific things people need to know before you even start talking about climate change. How to distinguish a problem from a symptom, because climate change is a symptom of global warming. And when you focus on the symptom, you will do what we call shift the burden. You will make things worse over time and create new problems. And so you want to make sure you're going as far upstream as you can within your sphere of influence. You want to treat the source, and that is to reverse global warming. So yes, we're going to need to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but the focus should be on reversing global warming by getting CO2 emissions where they need to be, reducing emissions and increasing absorption. Those are very specific things everybody needs to know in order to understand climate change.
I feel like I wanted to add just an active note, just because circling back to what Leo said, that he's not a science graduate. You know, I'm not a science graduate, and I think I've had an awareness of climate change for many years, but a sense that I had no right to say anything about it to anybody. And I think something that people need to know is that you do have a right to say something about it. You know, you can understand the basics, and it does affect all of us, you know, so you need to know that you can find a way to participate. You can find a way to make a difference.
And, you know, when you ask a question that people aren't asking of themselves, it literally changes their thinking already. You make space in their brain. They accommodate the question so that they can think differently. So you can ask questions. If you don't have the answers, ask a good question. Absolutely. I agree, Ali.
Ali, we had a point of clarification from someone in the audience who, right back at the start, you mentioned your sort of 5 key truths or facts about climate change. They've asked if you could let them know rather who it was that you cited.
Yeah, for sure. The person I was citing is Kimberly Nicholas. I have a website. It's called Climate Science 101. And I think she's referenced every single point, you know, and the points really are, the basics. It's warming. So, you know, if you look at those warming stripes, you know, that beautiful image, that picture that shows very clearly from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution going up to now, the sort of overall temperature, and you see it going from blue, little pink, getting redder and redder until it's finally like a really red, angry color on one side. I recently actually saw that mapped against a global loss of biodiversity over the same time period. And they'd taken those stripes and they'd taken the sort of the green, shades of green, fading into gray. And I thought that was an incredibly powerful way to communicate, you know, about the reality of warming and its impact. So point number 1 is that it's warming. Point number 2 is that we're sure. So again, looping back to the science, to the data, the images that we can see from NASA. You know, we can see from space what's happening, and we have photography going across decades to show that it's changing. There are ways of verifying, you know, what's going on. It's us, and it's bad, but that we can fix it. So those are the 5 points. Kimberly Nicholas, I'll put it in the chat.
Great, thank you. Thinking about sort of content providers and supporting climate action through the work that they do, how do we make sure that content providers focus on supporting climate action as a positive thing rather than either falling into the trap of greenwashing or creating climate anxiety with the people who are learning from them?
Yeah, that's
I think I would just slightly question that assumption. I think the different content providers need to sort of make a call really about what they're doing and to what audience. I don't think every single content provider needs to step into that space and to be doing that particularly. like as I said before, Carbon Brief, we don't advocate, we intentionally do not publish commentary, opinion. Obviously that, you can argue anyone you're going to be it's impossible to do value-free kind of writing or journalism to some extent, but we actively don't want to do that, because we feel there's other people in, as I said, in this kind of ecosystem of content providers that will do that, and we step back or step forward depending on what we think is the right moment for that. But I think so. Before we all begin to talk about that, I would say that just needs a little bit of unpacking, perhaps, about, or the assumption anyway, that all content providers should step into that and be thinking about that.
I think that one way, if you were walking into a kitchen and you saw the faucet on and you saw that the drain was clogged and that sink was going to overflow, you could spend the next 20 years calculating how much it was going to cost and what kinds of repairs it would take, or you could just go and turn off the faucet. And I do think that everybody has to take action. It's what makes it complicated is that our brains are not wired to read feedback that's removed in time and space and that's not casually observable. And so it's hard to get people to focus on something that that's hard to perceive. Now with all the storms and the floods, it's a little easier to perceive, but it still feels so far from what people have any sort of efficacy over. So I think if we can point out to people their unique contribution and their responsibility, figure out what they love, and help them connect what they love to what we're talking about, that they will find their own reason. A shared understanding and vocabulary, a personal rationale for why should I change my behavior, and becoming inspired and hopeful about their unique contribution. That works, because nobody is better at figuring out what they can do than they are, but they have to have a rationale for why they should get in the game.
Absolutely. I think I'm thinking about the hummingbird again. The story of the hummingbird was really that one little bird flew over to the lake and picked up a little bit of water to try and put out the fire. Of course, one bird can't put out the fire, but you have a whole host of hummingbirds all doing their little part. Drop by drop, we can make a change. And I think people really do need to be able to accept that it's true.
And the truth is, we do make a change, whether it's intended or not. There's no such thing as not making a difference. Yeah. So that's the key. So what kind of difference do you want to make? Yeah. And start making it.
I think that leads really nicely. There's a couple of related questions from the audience. And Leo, I take your point around the different types of content providers and the different roles. I think making an assumption that content providers, or at least some of them, do have a role to play in promoting climate action. The first question is, individual change will only go so far. Political will is also required. Should we as content providers be promoting the use of activism as a way to enable change? I'm saying whether I've read the right question now. Hold on one second. And then the sort of the related one here is seconding a question around individuals, corporations. If we want to promote fact-based learnings and avoiding spreading misinformation, what role do content providers have in putting pressure on politicians and corporations and encouraging individuals to do the same? How much emphasis should be placed on the impact of individuals' behaviours in the content that's produced?
Oof, that's a lot of questions. I would start by going back to the principle that we are all responsible for the difference we make. And remembering that everything we do and everything we don't do makes a difference. And to Leo's point earlier, you want to tell all the children and young people that you're not going to do anything about it. I've seen Lord of the Flies. Go for it. I think, there's one mental model or way of thinking that we find drives unsustainable behavior, and we call it the bummer. Things are the way they are and there's nothing we can do about it. The kids call them the given ups. May no one on this call ever be called a given up. So should people become activists? Should they do this or that? They should do whatever they can do to contribute to turning this ship around as consumers, as citizens, as parents, as children, as community members, as educators, as whatever they do for a living. Absolutely, they should do whatever they can. This is not a drill. And we need to work together at the local and global level to make this happen. No question about it.
I personally think the word activism can be unpacked a bit as well, because that can mean very different things to different people. It can mean on one end, being happy to get arrested on a protest. It can be, to sort of, non-violent civil action, in the decades and decades of history we've seen, and how that can help to enable change, through to, even you could argue activism is just going to vote, just participating in your democratic right if you live in a kind of democracy. I mean, I know we've got a very global audience on this call, and it's different for different people around the planet. But at a very simple level, do you have agency to put your name to put a cross against on a ballot sheet, or do you have is activism making a slightly different choice about the food you eat? Did you decide not to eat meat or dairy today compared to yesterday? There's so many different levels of activism, which means you're participating in, trying to solve this issue to some degree, rather than being a person who's aggravating and making the problem worse, just on that very simplistic level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think you said something very interesting about, did you eat meat today? That's such an important point. You don't have to suddenly become vegan overnight. You can reduce things. You can reduce the amount of meat that you eat. You can reduce the number of flights that you take. You can be imperfect. You don't have to do your activism, whatever it may be. You don't have to do it perfectly. You have to do the best that you feel that you can do today, given your personal circumstances. And I think that's really important, that sense that the situation is bad. We need to do what we can to make it slightly less bad. And you alone can't change everything. You can just do what you can do, and that's okay.
So I'm going to argue with you a little bit, because that's not an aspiration from my point of view, doing less bad.
Okay.
What kind of world do we want to create? And let's start walking toward that. And what do we need to do to get there? We, in terms of meat, we always talk about a pad thai approach to life. A little bit of meat or fish and a lot of grain and vegetables. We can debate how we're going to get there and look at the science and pay attention to what others are doing that's working. But we need to focus on where we want to go and what we want to create together. Because that is the only thing that's going to give people the motivation and the political will to keep moving. We need momentum, and to keep the momentum going, we need to have something more than the problem. And certainly, making things less worse is like slowing down on the way to the cliff. It's not going to solve your problem. It's better than speeding up, but at some point you have to turn.
I need to defend myself. You're absolutely right.
You don't have to. We're going to talk many, many times.
It's a phrase that I hear myself saying when I'm trying to bring somebody in who maybe hasn't got started yet. And I totally agree with you. We have this beautiful strategy at school, it's called Building the Future We Want. And I really agree with you about vision and ambition. I couldn't agree more. I do feel like, to get around that sense of doomism, that you've talked about before, this idea, it's all over, it's all finished anyway, why should I even begin? That's when I start to bring out the narrative of, well, it could be really, really bad, but it could be a little bit less bad. And sometimes actually that seems to have an effect, that seems to work. But I'm just being practical, I guess.
Thinking about education and schools, I guess, specifically, when we're thinking about, raising awareness about sustainability, educating for sustainability and promoting or supporting climate action, Is that something that content providers in that space should be thinking about across the curriculum?
Yes. Yes, I think educators have a responsibility to prepare young people to find their unique contribution and to unleash their potential and to contribute to the world we want to live in. I think absolutely we should be doing that. And I think how we do that, you know, I'm in schools all the time, and I can tell you it depends on the country. To Leo's point, depends on where you are, but documenting and mapping the actual curriculum and what kids are learning and when they're learning it. What we do what we call sustainabilize the curriculum. We embed the attributes of education for sustainability, all those ways of thinking and knowledge right into the core curriculum. It's not an add-on. It's not flavor of the month. It's a core attribute. The purpose of education is to educate for sustainability. And then, of course, professional learning and coaching and everything that teachers need to make this real over time. It would be certainly the organizational policies and practices, as Ali is working on. And yeah, it's absolutely possible. And we do it every day.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
Yeah, me too. This was maybe a decade ago, but I was briefly a school governor at this point, so I had both from a journalistic hat and also from parent and governor kind of angle. I was really intrigued to really drill in to find out what was actually on in the UK anyway, what we call our national curriculum, what is actually almost got the government rubber stamp kind of saying, and amongst the educators, what is being taught in schools around climate change. And I found it an incredibly hard thing to actually get a definitive answer on. I was given examples by government departments in the education departments about what is being taught in geography lessons, what is being taught in physics around climate change. But beyond that, it was really hard, and it was often very, very simplistic in terms of some of the very basic mechanics of, you know, how the climate is changing and what are some of the drivers of that. You know, obviously fundamental and important stuff to be teaching children, but there didn't seem to be a springboard on, from what I could tell anyway. And I'd be fascinated to hear from Jamie and Ali now about what they, as you know, in terms of the education system now, that extra piece. Okay, they banked the problem, they kind of get the problem. Where do they have that agency, and what are the solutions, and what are the levers they can pull themselves as individuals and within their communities? And within their sort of family structures, getting back to that, you know, the pester power that children have with their parents and, you know, with the people around them, to try and get them to do some meaningful action on climate change. Yeah, the curriculum, what is actually being instructed, if you like, for teachers to then teach their own pupils, right, is really interesting.
It's all over the place. I was asked recently to audit a curriculum to see to what extent they were educating for sustainability. And I said, great, can I see it? They said, oh no, we don't write it down. Okay. How can I audit something I can't see? It's all over the place. And schools of education are not, at least in the US and North America, are way behind where they need to be in preparing pre-service teachers to do this kind of work, even to design curriculum. I think there's going to be a huge role for really excellent published curriculum that people can adapt and adopt. And because I think doing what needs to be done is probably way more than most people at the local level are prepared to
but
do on their own.
Curriculum is such a political issue, right? Particularly in the US, you hear all the time of school boards in Texas or wherever being attacked because they've included some kind of, you know, fact in there, and, you know, a bunch of parents have lobbied for that to be taken out. And
absolutely,
and that it's kind of ground zero in a way, is what's in the school books for many parents, you know, particular ideologies or religion or whatever the things that are motivating them, they go after those school textbooks and, you know, as kind of ground zero of teaching children.
Well, we have that, and then we also have, I looked at some of our science standards, and they took matter out of the definition of the first law of thermodynamics. So now they just talk about energy. Well, emissions fall under the category of matter. So that's very confusing to people. It's all over the place. And we need to get a hold of it. And the educators need to take a stand and make sure that the curriculum is robust and differentiated and does what it needs to do.
I think it's just such an interesting question because, you know, I see this is what our system is trying to do now. You know, we're trying to create something inside the curriculum and we're trying to understand as a system, what does it mean, you know? So we've created a sort of a complementary course for our secondary students. So we have something to work from, you know, there's a set of competencies, we have a set of ideas that we've agreed that we need to teach. But, you know, how do you filter that then through your whole curriculum? That's not something, again, that we have written down, and teachers are, to a greater and lesser extent, inventing it themselves right now. So in primary school, in a sense, maybe it's easier because you can go and decide to ask the kids, what do they want to do? They don't fully understand the problem, but they know there's a problem and they can say, great, we want to go plant wildflowers and help all the bees. And we want to, you know, create more wild spaces. We can plant gardens. You know, I think the gap between what's being done and what's being understood and what's actually written down is going to take some time to bridge.
And the field of education for sustainable development has been around officially since 1992. We have standards and performance indicators and benchmarks and assessment tools, and the field is alive and well out there all over the world. I have colleagues in just about every country doing this kind of work. So it's not like we don't know what needs to go into the curriculum, and more of us are having influence over what's in the curriculum. But it's a key attribute. It's a key thing right now that everybody should be concerned with at their local level.
So, for example, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's not rocket science, but we do seem to be reinventing the wheel. And I think maybe that's something that actually has to happen. Maybe every person needs to go through their own understanding and their own learning process. I don't know. For example, in a maths lesson, sorry, I was going to say in a maths lesson. Okay. So we club together and we have a solar panel on the roof of our school. And, you know, it took a prompt from, you know, an outsider, you know, a business person to say, oh, in your maths lessons, are you going to work out how much energy you're saving? Are you going to do the maths on that? Are you going to actually filter through the real world that you're living in? You know, your organizational setting, you know, your school class. Are you filtering that into your lesson? And I think that's what people need to discover for themselves in a sense now. How can they connect classroom learning with actual action? You know,
absolutely.
With activities. And that's going to happen in a different way for each different school because we all have different situations. We're all in different physical locations.
Yeah, but I do think that the world of documentation and mapping these days is growing leaps and bounds at the school and the school system level. And so we can actually see the curriculum and see it evolve and have it live on in the building and in the districts over time. I mean, in some countries, everybody's on the same page on the same day. And in other countries, it's a free-for-all. So I think that is one of the ways that we are going to move this along much quicker and faster, is to be able to document and map it and then share it so that people are not having to reinvent the wheel all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I see so many barriers to that just sort of happening in our school because, you know, I think we're in one of the environments where people are not on the same page. You know, I had somebody who was involved in, you know, delivering on our framework. We have a kind of school framework in place. So in theory, that connects all stakeholders and it puts us on the same page and it gives us joint vision. You know, in practice, one of the people who was responsible for this felt, well, maybe we don't really want to speak directly about this to the students. We don't want to upset them, right? And she was not on the page of, you know, taking action is actually the only antidote that we have to climate anxiety. I mean, you know, if you're feeling anxious, you need to do something. But she was not on that page at all. And I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do together, in a sense, to get it off the page and into people's experience. And I'm very hopeful about this sort of the framework idea, you know, bringing together the idea that people are going to take what they have written down and actually talk about it together in a sense of different people who are bringing different perspectives to the table. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I do think that it's useful to bring your school community together. We spend we initially, when I start working with a school or a school system, bring folks together for about 2 days, just as a starting point, through a series of transformative learning experiences, so that we do build that shared understanding and vocabulary, so that everybody does have a chance to develop a personal rationale for why should I do this? Why are we doing this? And then to get inspired and hopeful about the unique contribution that education plays in contributing to the shift towards sustainability. People have to know that. What is our role as educators? And that definitely gets us set on the right direction. And then we ask for early adopters. Who's ready to sustainabilize something? And then they make the results visible, desirable, and doable for the next cohort and the next. And after that, you don't need cohorts anymore, because everybody's moving in that direction. And we have not had as much, I hear a lot of pushback. We haven't had as much as people would think, because it's an inclusive process and it's an academic process. And mathematicians and scientists, everybody's in the building. That's the beautiful thing about pre-12. You have mathematicians and scientists and writers and artists and athletes. They're all in the building. And when it comes down to it, they do an amazing job.
Okay, we've got 8 minutes left. There's 3 more questions I'm keen to cover. So I guess moving us on a little bit, we've obviously talked about educating for sustainability and climate change in science lessons and maths lessons. We've got a question around storytelling. So Helen Sutherland asks, I'd love to hear the speaker's thoughts on the power of storytelling in contributing to change. I believe content providers can make a difference with stories, not just fiction, but how people think about climate change and our power to have a better future.
Great question. Anybody want to go first? I think about that one quite a bit.
You go first.
So storytelling is one of the main ways of helping people expand their thinking, because when the story is told, so those people with the bummer or the given ups, the fastest way to get them to thinking, well, maybe it's possible, is through storytelling, because it literally rewires the brain and makes things possible that they couldn't see before. So telling stories about what young people are doing, what communities are doing, how people are doing the math, getting creative and making social contracts to work together to make those mid-course corrections, turning problems into opportunities, being able to hear stories of what this looks like is absolutely key. And it's the fastest way to do it. And it's so delicious and so much more beautiful and fun to move toward a sustainable future than it is to go problem by problem like whack-a-mole. It's just, no one turns back. It's an elegant, gorgeous experience, and it's joyful work.
I feel like children telling stories of what they've achieved or is something quite interesting, you know, or writing, I don't know, stories of what they would like what's the thing? Letters to Planet Earth, where children are encouraged to sit there and tell their story of what they would like to see, their beautiful vision, you know, and then they're encouraged actually to maybe send that off to a local politician. So you have this sort of connection between the audience. Who's the audience for these stories? And I think that's really important. And perhaps that's where one could start to move out of a comfort zone, in a sense. You know, if you're thinking more about trying to engage people who wouldn't usually hear these stories, spread the word a little bit further. I don't know. I think there's something there.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. Obviously, storytelling is vital. I would obviously say that as a writer. One thing I was thinking about is sort of visual storytelling. It's not just the written word. Visual storytelling is so important. I remember talking to, here in the UK, we obviously have the BBC, which is going back to the trusted or respected and authoritative kind of communicators. They have a soap opera, which some of you may have heard of, called EastEnders. And I remember talking to a climate campaigner about what, if you could have one thing, what would it be to help, you know, to convince people? And they said, if we could just get one of the storylines inside EastEnders, the soap opera, to be about climate change, to have one of the families that feature in it to sort of even discuss this issue around their kitchen table, and it would be seen by 10 million viewers who, you know, this highly popular program. And there was actually an attempt to lobby some of the writers and editors of that particular program to see if that could happen. It didn't happen on that program, but I remember about 10 years later, actually just a couple of years ago, I think it was, a whole week of Coronation Street, which is the rival soap opera to EastEnders here in the UK, on the commercial channel, ITV, that they ran a whole week of sort of climate change themed narratives and stories and, you know, episodes within that. And that was really, really fascinating to try a brand new approach to bringing storytelling around an issue like climate change to effectively a brand new audience. I thought that was really, really interesting. And that need for constant fresh thinking around who is your audience, what storytelling are you trying to do, and characterization. Who are those compelling characters? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? You know, who are the heroes? You know, it almost goes back to Shakespeare or the Greeks, or, you know, whatever. We can, you know, it's our human history. Every culture is rich, you know, for millennia through the importance of storytelling. So yeah, it's absolutely vital. It's great that this has come up as one of our last talking points.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and squeeze in very quickly one last question, which is, how do you envisage the role of content providers and journalism evolving over the next 5 to 10 years with regards to climate action? And we have about 40 seconds each. I'm going to start with Ali, if you're happy, Ali.
Yeah, sure. I just feel that we're going to evolve into a situation where people are much more positive. This negativity in the news, we have to dial it down. Nobody wants to be seeing so many negative stories, like we've said many times here. And I think positive energy and positive stories, and I think a few solutions, maybe. Thank you.
Leon?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I know we've got time very short, but one big talking point at the moment, which is often being cast as negative, but I think there are some positives on it, is artificial intelligence and how that's going to leach into and influence, whether we like it or not, is going to influence teaching, journalism, medicine, whatever, name it. I think we need to really be on the front foot to think about right now how that can be leveraged into creating positives and not just let it become this kind of fatalistic narrative that it's a bad thing. I think we have to deal with the fact it's here, and I think we have to look at that hard and deep.
And I envision that people will finally understand that education is, that sustainability and regeneration are the purpose of education, and that helping young people to build the capability to thrive over time is our goal and our role. And that students are the secret sauce, that young people are required in this area, and that schools and communities work and learn together towards the future we want. That's my vision.
That's great. Thank you all. At a risk of running over by about 1 minute, I wanted to say thank you so much, Ali, Leo and Jamie, for this discussion. I found it really fascinating, and I hope everyone in the audience has as well.